Welcome to the Clayton Tyner podcast, where we reframe current issues through the lens of ancient wisdom. This week, we look at the fallout from Donald Trump's latest indictment. While the former president getting indicted has become something we're used to, this newest lawsuit forced him to take an actual mugshot. Trump posed with an intense glare and is already leveraging the photo for his campaign. Did forcing him to take this picture help him or hurt him? Meanwhile, in Chicago, car thefts are up 234% in the last 2 years. Mayor Brandon Johnson is taking an unique approach to solving this issue. He is suing car makers, Kia and Hyundai, for making their vehicles too easy to steal. What does this odd strategy say about the state of law and order in Chicago? The first round of Republican debates took place, and although Trump was not present, it was clear he has forever altered the tone and tenor of political debates from here on out. Who were the winners and losers from the first sparring session? And more importantly, are the debates actually useful in helping the American people decide who should be their candidate of choice? All that, and one look at new COVID restrictions sneaking back into society. Lionsgate Studios and Morris Brown College have already started mask mandates, and rumors abound about other organizations getting ready to implement them as well. Are we headed back to another round of masking, lockdowns, quarantines, and social distancing? And if so, will the American people comply? Let's talk about it on episode 30 of the Clayton Tyner podcast. Episode 30, very excited. I remember, I think in episode 1, talking about episode 30, that we're going to give it a 30 episode arc, 30 episode run, really evaluate and see how things are going. And I've just been so encouraged by the conversations I've gotten to have in the comments, by the people who are subscribing and sharing. I want to remind you that you can follow me on Instagram and on Twitter at Clayton Tyner. That's Clayton Tyner. And the best thing that you can do to help this podcast thrive is to subscribe, especially on our YouTube channel. The majority of my energy is going to YouTube right now. I'm so thankful for everyone who listens to audio only on the RSS feed, but I'd love to ask you, if you have some time, to come over to youtube.com/Clayton Tyner, that's Tyner, and subscribe on the channel as well. And if you want to know what my real job is, I am the lead pastor at Meta Church, and you can get caught up with what we're doing there at youtube.com/Meta Church. We are a local church in San Antonio, Texas, and we exist to be a Christian community where you can belong with us and be loved by us, even before you believe exactly what it is we believe. It really is a safe space to wrestle with like the biggest questions of life and faith and spirituality. If you're new to the podcast, what we try to do on here is to look at current issues, things that are in the news, things that are happening socially and sometimes even politically, and to look at them the best we know how through the lens of the ancient wisdom, especially the ancient wisdom of Scripture. And in our world, things are so polarizing and there's so little nuance. And so we're trying to add some nuance back into the conversation, even when we do have strong convictions, to handle those with grace. And if you are a believer, then the way that we interact with what's going on in the world should be an example of our Savior that we're following. And if you are not a believer, then hopefully this podcast can be an example, even if you disagree with my takes or my points of view, of a way of looking at the world where we can have peace among each other and still hold to strong convictions. So with all that being said, let's get to our 3 points. The shot heard around the world is a phrase that refers to the opening shot of the battles of Lexington and Concord on April 19th, 1775. This is what sparked the American Revolutionary War and led to the creation of the United States. That same phrase has also been used for the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914, a catalyst for World War I. It's a phrase that symbolizes a single action in a moment in time that sets a course of events into motion that cannot be stopped. once they begin. In 2023, we now have the MugSHOT heard around the world. Former president and current leader of the opposition party, Donald Trump, has been indicted for the 4th time. And with the publishing of his MugSHOT, the world can no longer ignore the fact that things have changed. A single action in a moment of time that sets a course of events into motion that cannot be stopped once they begin. The MugSHOT heard around the world. Unless you have been absolutely living under a rock, you have seen this MugSHOT, possibly the most famous photo that has ever been taken. Only history will really reveal that. But this will go down as one of the most trafficked images that has ever existed. It really is a moment where things begin to shift. And there are things like this all the time. There are the shots heard around the world that started the Revolutionary War and that started World War I. There are all kinds of moments in our lives that act as doors, that once we walk through those doors, they shut behind us and they lock from the inside. In other words, things change and you can never go back to the way that things were. We see moments like this all throughout scripture, like Adam and Eve falling for the temptation to be their own gods. Once they break God's one rule, the rule that established relationship with God, things changed and they changed forever. And now we're longing for the garden. We're longing for closeness and proximity to our Creator. Things happen like this all of the time. When Abraham was willing to walk up the mountain and sacrifice his son, that was a single action in a moment in time that set a course of events in play that could never be undone. In more recent history, although it's still ancient history, when the Roman military crossed the Rubicon. That's another saying. The shot heard around the world. Another saying is crossing the Rubicon. If you grew up in a small country town like me, someone would say that's a bell that can't be unrung. In other words, once you take this action, there is no going back. And this feels certainly like one of those moments, specifically because we have been a country now for over 250 years. We're still young in the scope of world history, but we have some time under our belt. We've had 46 presidents now, and we have never indicted or prosecuted or gone after certainly the former president, and definitely not the opposition leader, the leader of the opposition party. And so look, you may 100% believe that that's the correct course of action. And I'm of the opinion generally that if people do break the law, that justice has to be done. And right, left, and center, most people agree we live in a two-tier justice system. It's kind of like if you've ever seen that image of the rabbit and the bunny. It's the same image, but depending on who's looking at it, some people see a rabbit, some people see a bunny. There's other things like this. Is the person turning to the left or turning to the right? Is the purse or is the dress blue or is it gold? You know, there's all of these things where one person completely sees it one way and one person completely sees it the other way. Most people agree we have a two-tier system of justice. They just disagree on who's getting the advantage and who is disadvantaged in that. We have an all-time low in trust in our institutions, trust in our government, trust in law enforcement, trust in the judicial system. And so we're in a very precarious situation. I am fine with people who commit crimes being held to account. I think you have to have that to have a functioning society. But if we're going to do it, we've got to do it for everyone. What we have are 4 indictments now, all of which are hotly contested, hotly debated. These are somewhat subjective cases. Almost every one of them comes down to intention, and trying to read intention is one of the most difficult things we can do from one human to another. As a matter of fact, psychology shows that the better you think you are at assessing someone's intentions, probably the worse you actually are at it. All of this is not new in the scope of world history. In the scope of world history, you see people consolidating power by prosecuting, indicting, imprisoning the political opposition all of the time. This is actually very, very common all throughout history. It just is typical of banana republics and third world, dictatorships and things that we have always prided ourselves on not being a part of. The Attorney General, who is, part of who keeps the law and order in our country, tweeted out a couple of weeks ago about how he just unilaterally stands against countries imprisoning people for political means, imprisoning people who are in opposition to the government. And most people think who he's actually talking about is Alexei Navalny, who is a famous YouTuber. He's a famous Russian who opposes Putin and Putin's entire regime. And he has been imprisoned, and he's been held in prison for a long time. And he was poisoned once. And, that's what we think happens over there, not here, but over there. However, if you were to listen to, and you probably shouldn't, but if you were to listen to Putin and to his media, what they would say is that this guy has been legitimately indicted. He's actually been indicted on 4 different accounts on 4 different occasions. In 2013, he was convicted of embezzlement. He was accused of embezzling funds from a state-owned timber company. In a separate case, he was accused of defrauding a French cosmetics company. He faced multiple charges of slander and insult for his critical statements about Russian officials and politicians. And the last charge was for an alleged violation of parole related back to the 2014 embezzlement conviction. And who knows, man? I'm not over there. I don't know the details on all of that. I am like most people in the West who just, at my core, apolitically, am just uncomfortable with subjective indictments of opposition political parties. When Trump ran on lock her up, I think that Hillary's handling of classified material was really bad. Some of it seemed, even when James Comey came out, to be certainly illegal, towing the line. And I thought lock her up is a bad idea. I assumed she would run again. And I don't think that's the kind of country that you want to live in. The MugSHOT heard around the world. It forced people, because you can hear, a picture's worth 1,000 words. You can hear about the indictments. You can hear about the details. You can hear about him going in. You can hear about him, showing up to court. But to see a mugshot of a former president, it just is quite startling. And if a picture is worth 1,000 words, this mugshot is probably worth, I don't know, a million words. And it just feels like we have now set a precedent that is quite dangerous, especially considering that we have allowed our country to become run by some of the most corrupt people in the world. Like, if we wanted to bring in, when I say subjective indictments, I mean, Trump isn't on trial for murder. He's not on trial for arson. He's not on trial for these very objective things where you can just go to a crime scene and look at the facts. It's subjective. It's based on trying to decipher his intention behind his words and actions for most of the cases, not all of them. And I think Trump might be in some real trouble, especially on the classified documents case. But a lot of this does come down to subjective measures. The same would have been true trying to decipher Hillary's intentions with her emails and her intentions with smashing Blackberries or all these different things that she did. It's just a subjective case for someone who very well could run for president again. And the reason is because you are setting precedent, and you are crossing the Rubicon. You are ringing a bell that can't be unrung. And if we are going to function where every time the other party takes power, they go after the political opposition, we are spiraling into a form of society that I don't think anybody wants to live in. We have the opportunity to really live out what we put forth in our founding documents, these ideals that have taken a long time to continue to perfect. But this prosecution has changed our political system in ways that I don't think we can possibly understand right now. I worry about what this means in the long run. I worry about retaliation from right-wing DAs and right-wing politicians, because the general feel in politics is we don't want to be dirty. We don't want to be dirty. But if you're going to play that way, we have to play that way too, or we're just going to get rolled over. And decisions have real consequences. So maybe you completely think this is deserved. I have a totally wrong read on this. I don't know enough details. That's fine. Tell me in the comments. I'm always open to learning. I had something happen in my house that I thought really might show the duck and rabbit kind of optics of this mugshot. Because my question is, do you think the mugshot hurts or helps Trump? Tell me in the comments, do you think it hurts him or do you think it helps him? And of course, like everything, it's so polarized. Right-wing media is saying this has completely backfired on the left. This was a political hit job. I did see that in Philadelphia for celebrities, they don't have to take a mugshot as long as they have a recent photo. So they did force Trump to do this, right? There was some optics that someone was looking for or some drama that someone was looking for. But do you think it hurts him or it helps him or maybe both? My read, and this is not an original read, is that this massively helps him in the primaries. No one is even close to him right now. He raised like over $7 million when he released this. So it's catalyzing people to his cause. And I do think it's a high bar for many people in the country to pass. And you can see this statistically. It's, somewhere between 60 and 70% of people who are saying when polled that I will not vote for Trump under any circumstance. So I do think the indictments and maybe even the mugshot still hurt him in the general election. I think that's going to be a high bar. Now, there's a lot that can happen, and it's very hard to forecast. And I'm not a political forecaster. I wonder if you think it hurts him or helps him. We are seeing anecdotally that some people are seeing this who are even on the left or who didn't vote for Trump in 2020, who do feel very uncomfortable with the photo evidence, a picture's worth 1,000 words, of what we're currently in process of doing here. I had something happen in my house. We go through a lot of eggs. I love eggs. I love every kind of egg, scrambled, over medium, omelets, sunny side up. I love eggs. Too much talking about eggs.
Wow.
I'm new to podcasting. Way too much talking about eggs. However, we got some eggs and we had something somewhat rare where one of the eggs had a feather on it. Okay. And we thought this was cool. And my wife and I, we saw that like visual reminder that eggs don't come from 18-wheelers, right? If you don't know that, eggs come from chickens.
Wow.
It's amazing, right? So my son, who is 14 now and also eats a lot of eggs, we thought this will be cool. This is a reminder of like, this is from nature and it really comes from chickens and we're thankful for chickens. If we didn't live in an HOA, we would have, 20 chickens and we'd eat fresh eggs all the time. But the HOA says, no, so we can't do that. But we showed Paxton thinking he'd think like us, right? The same image, one of our eggs with a feather on it, and he thought it was disgusting. He's like, I'm never eating eggs again. I'm out. That is so gross. That is a butt feather. Like I want nothing to do with this anymore. The same image and two completely different reactions. I think that really is what we're going to get. I think some people are obviously dancing on Trump's proverbial grave. They're excited by this. And some people, say what you want about Trump. He understands optics. He is like a meme generator. He is a whatever else he is good at and whatever else he is bad at. He is a like marketing genius. And he knows how to get people talking. And he stood in a mirror for hours picking out exactly how he was going to look at that camera. It was all done very, very intentionally, very, very purposeful. It is the mugshot heard around the world. I am concerned about how it might change the political system and political processes in this country. And I want to know from you, does the mugshot help him or does it hurt him? Brandon Johnson, the new mayor of Chicago, blames the car manufacturers, Kia and Hyundai, for their cars being too easy to break into. Auto theft is up over 100% this year and 234% over the last 2 years in Chicago. Now, some may think that the issue is that people are stealing cars that don't belong to them. And, you can actually blame those people because they have minds and a free will and volition, and they made the choice to forcibly break into a car, bypass the ignition, and hotwire that car, and then drive off with someone else's property. However, Mayor Johnson blames the cars themselves. It's kind of like blaming the victim, except in this case, it's an inanimate object with no mind or will or volition. Of course, if it is a Kia, it may have a soul.
Wow.
What does this approach expose about soft on crime policies and how people respond to the incentives that they are given? We have a news article from a local Fox affiliate in Chicago. Mayor Johnson mocked for suing automakers for car thefts. The numbers speak for themselves. Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson is facing backlash after filing suit against Kia and Hyundai over claims that they manufactured cars that lack appropriate anti-theft measures, ultimately leading to a surge in car crimes. Democratic ALD, I don't know what that means, Raymond Lopez mocked Johnson over the lawsuit on Fox and Friends, calling the move a play from a socialist playbook as crime continues to ravage streets in the Windy City. Clearly, we don't have a crime problem. We have a Kia problem. That's a good joke. In the city of Chicago, according to Mayor Johnson. Lopez told Steve Doocy on Monday, the numbers speak for themselves, 104% increase from last year, a 234% increase in vehicle thefts from 2 years ago, but yet it's the car's fault. It's the fact they're so easily taken by criminals who run rampant in the city of Chicago. But we have yet to hear our mayor say anything, one word about the criminals running rampant in the streets. This is such an interesting and very pointed critique of a lot of legislation that has been put out at the local level, the level of cities, the level of states, a lot of things that you hear about, echoes of and whispers of, they're just not popular enough at the federal level. All of these things that are considered soft on crime, things like no cash bail, where if you are caught for something, then you pretty quickly go to a trial, and a lot of the times at this trial, you are put out on bail without having to put any cash up. And what cash would do is it would force people to have to come up with a certain amount of money if they want to, leave their incarceration. And however you feel about that, the actual results are that people are committing crimes of high dollar property theft, auto theft. In the case of this specific story, people are sometimes even committing somewhat violent crimes. And they're out on the streets within days, sometimes within hours. And we just know statistically that when somebody commits a crime and they feel like they get away with that crime, even if they spend, a night in jail and they go back out, they are highly likely to continue doing the criming. Okay. And we're seeing this as crime statistics run out of control across our country in major cities with soft on crime policies. They're also really, really reducing sentencing and reducing consequence on things, especially like auto theft. No maximum sentences. Here's what it comes down to. Most people are just incentive-driven machines. Now, that's unfortunate. It's unfortunate that that kind of becomes the status quo of life, where we're just responding to incentive, because that is humans who have the ability to live lives of purpose and meaning and to set goals for their future and to create strategies in order to execute on those goals. It takes all of that God gave us as these unique creatures, unique among all creation, created in the image of God, and it brings us down really to our base level, our almost animalistic instincts, where we're just responding to stimulus. We're just responding to incentive. It's just a few notches above just living off of instinct, living off of incentive. This is what James, the half-brother of Jesus, said, but each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. And then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it's full grown, gives birth to death. He's kind of laying out this path of how we get to these poor decisions that we make, and even a step beyond that, of when we live in this way, where we allow ourselves to be enticed by our desires, when we give constantly into the temptation of perverse incentives around us, then it leads to sin, which is breaking God's desire and design for our life. That is laid out for us pretty clearly in the scripture. Most importantly, Jesus said to love God and to love the people around you. Well, stealing someone's car is certainly not loving the people around you. Breaking into someone's business is not loving someone around you. Robbing somebody, hurting somebody, murdering someone. So when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And then sin, this kind of lifestyle where you're constantly giving into the temptation of perverse incentives, when you're constantly dragged away by your evil desires, when you're constantly enticed, when desire is conceived, when you're constantly living in this sin, and when many, many, many people are doing this, it gives birth to death. It gives birth to the kind of statistics that are driving people out of major American cities. It gives birth to homicide rates in many of our American major cities that are actually becoming as high and some significantly higher than third world countries who, for all of us growing up, were like the places that you didn't go visit because it was so dangerous and the homicide rate was so high. We have major American cities now who are getting up to those kinds of levels. The idea that you can address this issue by suing Kia, by suing Hyundai, this is like suing a pencil manufacturer because somebody keeps making spelling errors. I mean, this is so wild. Auto theft is a symptom. The laws incentivizing criminal behavior, that's the actual disease. And the car manufacturers aren't even a part of the mathematical equation. They're just making cars. And apparently what happened is some Kias and some Hyundais, especially older ones, they have a pretty easy way to get the ignition going. And people started posting this on TikToks and stuff showing, and then the specific, theft of those types of cars skyrocketed. It went through the roof. Well, whose fault is that? This is so wild. If you take it to the symptom and the disease, this is like trying to cure diabetes by like suing Little Debbie's for being too delicious. You're not addressing the behaviors that are driving this. This is the weirdest form of victim blaming ever in the world. In Ezekiel 18, the prophet goes through this whole concept of how the sons don't get punished for the sins of the father. And what it says kind of over and over again is that the one who sins must die. And this is what justice means. Justice requires consequence that matches action. Justice requires consequence that matches action. Justice, quite simply defined, is getting what you deserve and not getting what you do not deserve. So we have two miscarriages of justice. Number one, the people who are committing these crimes are not getting any kind of consequence that matches that action. They're getting a slap on the wrist. They're getting put back on the streets. You've seen kind of related to this in many American major cities. You're seeing shoplifting just go through the absolute roof. You're seeing huge companies who are pulling out of major American cities or who are laying off vast swaths of workers because they're saying we just have too much merchandise being stolen from our stores. Well, when you have cities who say we're not prosecuting shoplifting below $950, then people just grab their trash bags and walk into your store and steal your stuff. Is a huge miscarriage of justice. Justice is getting what you deserve. And when you break laws, you deserve consequence. Justice is also not getting what you do not deserve. And so the miscarriage of justice goes two ways, because the Walgreens, who now are having things just ripped from their shelf, they do not deserve that, and they're getting it anyway. And Kia and Hyundai do not deserve to be sued because some people choose out of their own free will and volition to respond to perverse incentives in the law and order of their major cities and steal someone else's property. All of it is just so backwards, so upside down. And there's kind of a comparison out there right now that quite a few people are talking about. And that comparison is El Salvador. El Salvador is one of those Central American countries that for the longest time, you were just advised not to travel to because the homicide rate was so high. It truly was a dangerous place. This is from the Wall Street Journal. The country with the highest murder rate now has the highest incarceration rate. It says El Salvador, long whipsawed by gang violence that made it one of the world's most dangerous countries, turned things around by jailing huge swaths of its population. The country, once known for having the world's highest murder rate, now has the world's highest incarceration rate, about double that of the US. Since March 2022, President Nayib Bukele's government has implemented a campaign to arrest en masse suspected members of the MS-13 and 18th Street gangs that have long terrorized the impoverished Central American nation, blocking economic growth and stoking U.S.-bound migration. The strategy has helped lower homicides by 92% compared with 2015, giving Bukele the support of 9 out of every 10 Salvadorans, poll show. The number of Salvadorans illegally crossing the U.S. Mexico border has dropped by 44%. A 92% reduction in the homicide rate. Back a few years ago, their homicide rate was something like 52 for every 100,000 people in the country. And now it's down at like 7. Now it's significantly lower than New Orleans, significantly lower than Chicago. El Salvador made sure that justice was served by having consequence that matches action. Now, the argument from many people, especially people with a strong humanitarian bent, is that they're moving so quickly and they're doing things like trying 100 gang members at a time. And I mean, just hearing that, it sounds like trying 100 people at a time would make it very difficult for every single one of those people to actually get to make their case. And so they are saying they think that there are some innocent people who are also being imprisoned and jailed, especially people who are in these impoverished communities and may not be able to take up for themselves. That's an issue too. It's an issue on the other side of the equation because justice requires consequence that matches action. And if there are people who are being imprisoned, what they're in right now is what I think is almost a natural law, which is like the natural law of overcorrection. Gangs were running El Salvador, and now they have overcorrected to like, we're rounding everyone up, we're trying them all in one day, and we're throwing all of them in prison. You have to be careful about that as well. You have to temper that. What we want is justice, and what God calls for is justice in his world and for his people to stand up for justice. And that should be our call. And it is not loving to allow people to escape the natural consequence of their actions. And I think that sometimes Christians fall into that. We have very soft hearts and we have a humanitarian bent. And so we will become enablers of poor behavior, not allowing people to suffer the consequences of their action. And God set up a world of action, reaction, of consequence, natural consequence. And it's important for us to have the appropriate boundaries, including in our law and order system, to allow people to come under those consequences, because God uses consequence to draw us to himself. That's part of his discipline. That's part of how he lovingly brings his children to himself. The first round of debate between Republican presidential hopefuls was a mix of pre-scripted talking points, unintelligible arguing over one another, and WWE-style attempted smackdowns, especially from Vivek. Trump's mark seems forever imprinted on political debate and discourse in the way Americans view the success of their candidates. However, it's worth asking, is this format for debate actually helpful in guiding the American people toward the best candidate possible? Some 13 million people watched the debates live between all of these Republican presidential hopefuls. There are millions and millions more who have seen the clips or who have watched it back or who watched different live streams. And really, this is, at this point, kind of like the race for number 2. You know, the battle for second place. This is who's going to make the JV team because Trump is absolutely running away with it. And if you are a Trump supporter, you're probably really happy about that. If you're on the left, you might be frustrated by that, or you might be happy because you think that the left has the best chance of beating Trump out of all of the candidates. If you're on the right, but a lot of people on the right do not like Trump, then you're not happy about that. And you're hoping that some of these guys can consolidate around one guy or one woman. And overall, my issue with the debates is they're not actually about any policy. And even if they were, even if they didn't have all the theatrics and all of the jabs thrown at one another, the format itself just does not allow for the American public to hear any form of nuanced thought from any of the candidates. Now, they can go and do a town hall all by themselves and you can really hear them, but the power of debate is for all these thoughts. You can listen to them on a podcast, you can listen to them at a town hall, they can lay out all of their policies, but the sweet sauce is having someone they're running against to try and poke holes in what they're saying, or to bring another perspective, or to try and explain in a nuanced way why their proposal is better than the other person's. And you don't end up getting that for several reasons. Number one, everyone has a very, very short time to talk. This whole podcast, Clayton Tyner podcast, is about trying to bring nuance into some of these conversations because it just seems to be so lacking. And it's also very, very much lacking from the debate stages on both the right and the left. I mean, the presidential debates between Biden and Trump were just almost unwatchable. No matter where you're at politically, they were just two old men talking at the exact same time the entire time.
Wow.
Not fun to listen to, hard to decipher who's actually making good points. And what Trump did in 2016, and it started in the Republican primaries, and look, everyone has made fun of people, and Ronald Reagan had zingers, and Bill Clinton was quick on his toes. But Trump came in like a WWE wrestler. And oddly enough, he used to show up at the WWE every once in a while as a character. This guy is a celebrity. He knows how to work a room. He knows how to work a camera. So he came in, he started nicknaming people, he called Marco Rubio small, he called Jeb Bush. I think he was the first sleepy Jeb Bush. And it just became about character assassination. And do not get me wrong, it is entertaining. I'm not asking if it's entertaining. I'm asking if it's helpful. And you can really see Trump's mark, because now what a lot of people want to see, and maybe especially on the right now, whoever is in the opposition party really wants to see, is a fighter. And part of how you show you're a fighter is you go after people. And so I pulled up just some of the highlights. This video is actually from MSNBC, certainly not a right-wing news network. And every compilation of highlights is this. It is the professional wrestler going at you, terrible rap diss track, Mike Pence from the top rope, just throwing a people's elbow at Vivek. That's kind of what the whole thing is. So we'll watch some of these highlights.
This country at home and abroad. Now is not the time for on-the-job training.
Oh, Mike Pence. On-the-job training.
Bring in a rookie. We don't need to bring in people without experience.
Let us be honest as Republicans. I'm the only person on the stage who isn't bought and paid for, so I can say this.
Watch out, Vivek Ramaswamy from the top rope. It just goes on and on. Shots fired.
I've had enough already tonight of a guy who sounds like ChatGPT.
No, he didn't, ladies and gentlemen. Chris Christie. Okay, so that was a bit for the 7 people who watch this that also watch WWE. That's John Cena. You can't see him. This is what it has turned into. It's performative. And part of what I was thinking is, do we want our politics to be that, to be WWE, to be pre-scripted, to be theatrical, to be over the top, character assassination? Do we want heroes and heels? Do we want WWE fake wrestling? Or do we want it to be actual MMA, mixed martial arts, UFC, the real deal? I'm a UFC fan, and everyone loves the knockouts. Okay. Sugar Sean O'Malley just had a crazy knockout, crazy finish. What's interesting is mixed martial arts is about seeing who is the best overall fighter. And so some guys are jiu-jitsu artists and some guys are wrestlers. And a lot of the guys who do really, really technical things are loved by true fans of mixed martial arts. And they're hated by the crowds, because they'll take someone down, they will grapple them. It's not exciting. Nobody's getting punched. Nobody's getting knocked out. And you'll actually hear an entire arena turn on someone who is actively winning the fight, because what they came for was not the actual art of mixed martial arts. What they came for was a realer version of WWE. They want the highlights. They want the trash talk. They want the outfits. And that's fine if that's what you want. I'm just not sure that that's how we actually determine who the best person is to lead our country. Like this format where, I don't know, 30, 40% of the debate are two people talking concurrently. Maybe you have a lot better auditory processing skills than I do. If two people are talking at the same time, it might as well be no one talking.
Wow.
I just can't do it. I hear nothing. If two songs are playing at the same time, I cannot hear either of the songs. And it just my brain turns off. And that's so much of what the debate is. It's two people talking at the same time, or four people all talking at the same time. And then they did something over and over again where they would take a high level issue, like an issue that would take, if you were well prepared, 3 solid minutes to explain at minimum where you're at on it. And they would say, if you're for this, raise your hand. You know, if you think climate change is man-made, raise your hand. That's a very difficult question to just answer with the raise of a hand. Like, do humans lead to climate change? Yes. Is there a minority of the people in our country who worship nature like Mother Gaia and have completely gone off the rails? And like, yes, as well. Like, there should be a nuanced discussion there. If President Trump is in prison, are you still going to support him? Raise your hands. Like, we should have conversation around this. And I think the format is broken. And I think the incentivization is broken. And I actually think there is a psychological component to this as well. You know, we're always assessing things that we should be afraid of. You're doing that all of the time at a subconscious level. You know, this is why when you're about to walk in the street and someone honks their horn and you hear a motor that's close to you, you don't have to think about jumping out of the way. Your body, you know, the very base of your brain, your amygdala that sits right on the top of your spinal cord, that's what it's responsible for in large part, is self-protection. And when we go fully, like our upper cortex shuts down and we go fully down into that amygdala, that's when fight or flight takes place. And that's when aggression also comes out. And one of the things that creates an innate sense of fear is a lack of time. When you don't feel like you have enough time to do something, there is a psychological reality playing out on debate stages that people know they're given 30 seconds to respond, and there's no way that they can give the nuanced answer that they respond. It actually leads people into a psychological state where aggressive behavior should honestly be expected. And we see it. And I'm not saying anyone's like smacking each other with folded chairs up there, but they're doing their best with the incentives that they're given and with the way that many people are scoring these debates, which isn't about the nuance of their policy positions or their leadership acumen. It's about how strong they can appear by putting down and fighting the people around them. And so I'm just wondering if it wouldn't behoove us to, number one, get to the real contenders a lot more quickly. And you might completely disagree with that. You may think there should be more people on this stage, but more people on this stage only exacerbates the issues that I'm pointing out. And you might disagree with the issues I'm pointing out. But for me, to get to the place where we have a few people who can sit down in a moderated discussion, I am officially pro-conflict. I think that conflict is necessary in almost every endeavor. It's necessary in your relationships. And we should see the conflicting ideas, the conflicting policies, the conflicting leadership styles of these people, but we should see them in longer formats. What am I suggesting? Am I suggesting that all of the candidates come on to the Clayton Tyner podcast? Why, yes, I am. I think that would be a magical idea. Is that going to happen? No, it's not. But is there a better format for this? And I don't know. Would Americans actually pay attention? Here's what James says. He says, "Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, for the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God." We have perverse incentives on the debate stage, because if you do what Scripture instructs us to do that produces righteousness, which is right standing. And I think we would want a right standing leader. If you do this, Tim Scott tried this approach. And I think, Tim Scott talks a lot about God and his relationship with Jesus. If he was doing this better than anyone, and it was like he wasn't there. If you're not willing to be big and bold and loud and aggressive, then you're going to get consumed by the other people on that stage. You have no shot, which means we could be putting ourselves in a position where the person who's the best at debate is the person who always wins the presidency of our country. And look, when you do debate club in school, you're given a topic and then you're given a side of that issue that you may not even believe in. But if you can argue the best, you can win for it, right? Well, that's a skill set that could be completely separate from the skill sets needed to actually effectively lead the world's leading superpower, the United States of America. Part of it is, what are the American people wanting? And the people who put on the debates are also responding to the incentive of what the American people will tune into and give high ratings to. Jesus tells this parable of the four soils in Mark chapter 4. And I can read it really quickly. It goes like this. Listen, consider the sower who went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seed fell along the path and the birds came and devoured it. That's the first kind of soil. And other seed fell on rocky ground where it didn't have much soil, and it grew up quickly since the soil wasn't deep. But when the sun came up, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. And other seed fell among thorns, and the thorns came up and choked it, and it didn't produce fruit. And still other seed fell on good ground, and it grew up, producing fruit that increased 30, 60, and 100 times. So this is about the gospel proclamation. Some people, they're just not going to be able to receive it. Some of it is going to fall on very shallow ground, people who get really excited about it at first. But man, as soon as suffering comes, they're just gone. And some people are surrounded by thorns in their life, and those thorns just choke the life out of them. And then there's a percentage that's really good ground. And this parable that is about the gospel proclamation and people receiving the gospel, it is also very transferable to many aspects of life, including how people receive any information. And some people are very shallow, and what they're looking for is a presidential candidate who can just throw the best one-liners and who isn't afraid to really go after people and make personal attacks. Some people are just on the path. They're not even in the soil yet. They're not even paying attention. Some people are living surrounded by thorns and surrounded by distraction, and all they have time for is the sound bites. And I think there is good, fertile ground that wants to actually see what someone's leadership is and understand their policies. And I don't know what those percentages are. I think it would probably be disappointing. America may not be fertile ground for meaningful, nuanced conversations, but I do think we further harden the soil and reproduce thorns by feeding the people these theatrical debate performances. And maybe our primary goal should actually be putting these candidates in a format where we can actually find out who the best option is to lead our country. And now let's get to our last segment. Several organizations have acted as first movers, reinstituting mask mandates as a new strain of COVID makes its way to the United States. While 2020 now seems like a different lifetime to most of us, we do remember living through lockdowns, mandates, distancing, and the erasing of millions of non-essential jobs. With all that we now know about COVID, will we see a government mandate again? And if so, what will the reaction be from the American populace? So Lionsgate Entertainment, they instituted some kind of mask mandate. I do think they've actually backed off of that. Now, Morris Brown College, there's all kinds of rumors that it's coming back to the TSA and then it's going to come back to the airports. And some of these are very spurious rumors. There are a lot of people talking about it. There was a CNN article that came out. Is it time to bring the masks back? And all of this seems like we're headed to some version or at least debates around whether or not it's time for the second round of COVID. And this is like the sequel that nobody is asking for. COVID Part 2, even COVIDier, Lockdowns 2, Electric Boogaloo. Like what's the actual plan, not just for implementing this, But what is the plan for convincing the American populace? And I wonder, you can sound off in the comments, do you think people will go for this? Do you think they will remask in public places? Do you think people would be willing to quarantine or, 14,000 days to slow the spread or whatever that looks like? We'll look at this report. It says, President Joe Biden said Friday he'll ask Congress for additional funding for the development of a new COVID vaccine. The president announced his request for more funding while speaking to reporters as he vacations in Lake Tahoe, California. I signed off this morning on a proposal we have to present to the Congress, a request for additional funding for a new vaccine that is necessary and that works. Biden, according to the Associated Press, adding, it will likely be recommended that everybody get it, no matter whether they've gotten it before or not. Very interesting to say we're going to make a vaccine that works. I don't know what that's supposed to imply, but it's interesting you said that. Pfizer and Moderna are currently working on new vaccines to fight the latest Omicron strain, as some scientists warn of rising COVID cases. At the end of July, COVID hospitalizations were just over 9,000. That's only a fraction of the admissions that were seen during the height of COVID and later surges. The slight rise in COVID cases has caused some businesses and universities to reinstate mask mandates. So there is about 2 years of data now. What we now know, not just about COVID as a virus, but what we know about the measures that we took initially to try and fight this thing off. If you have held any kind of leadership position, you've probably led through some kind of tension or some forms of emergency. And if you have led at any level and have led through emergency, then you should have some level of grace for how difficult it is when you're in the thick of an emergency. It kind of started, the whole thing started under Trump. The first half of all the lockdowns and mandates were under Trump. The second half were under Biden. It was highly divisive, highly political. People were very heated. There's like endless Instagram videos of people screaming at each other in restaurants and stores, and everyone kind of lost their mind and nobody really knew what was going on. And what's so difficult about it is it's hard to, in the moment, have the data necessary, especially for something that is very scientific by nature, when you're in it. And so now we're not in it. We can look back, and in emergencies, what's very, very necessary is to look back and post-mortem, to evaluate what did we do, what happened, what went wrong. The tension when we were in the thick of it was, this is America, we should lean towards freedom. And the other side of the tension was public safety. And those two things, at least seemingly, were at odds at times. And different people of different political persuasions fell on different sides of that tension, and it created a lot of tension and it created a lot of division. Now we have looked back, and here's some things that we know. A lot of promises that we were made about the vaccines just simply did not happen. We were told very clearly that the initial ones will work. That's what Biden said about the new ones. We're going to make new ones and it will work. Now he's going to have to define what work means, because initially the vaccines were defined as you will not catch it at all and you cannot pass it to other people. And neither of those things were true. Like those weren't true. We know that now. People treated masks, even cloth masks, homemade masks, like they were the answer. And we now know definitively that they just were not. That was not the answer. That was not what was going to save us. There's a major new study that shows masks don't stop the spread of COVID. The COVID pandemic is in the rearview mirror. We have plenty of data about it, including studies telling us how well our countermeasures worked. A dozen scientists from around the world conducted a massive meta-study of our efforts to fight COVID, as well as similar efforts to fight the flu, and they published the results in the Cochrane database of systematic reviews. The authors examined 78 different studies on the efficacy of different mitigation efforts, such as masking, distancing, screening, quarantining, and hand washing. And so how do these interventions affect the spread of the flu, COVID, or similar viruses? The studies included included were diverse. They covered epidemics as well as periods of low transmission. Most important was what they had in common. They were all randomized controlled trials, or at least cluster randomized control trials. So what did they find? For starters, hand washing was effective in stopping the spread. But here's the most eye-opening finding. Wearing masks in the community probably makes little or no difference to the outcome of influenza-like illness / COVID-19-like illness compared to not wearing masks. In other words, masks did not do much, if anything. Now, they did. I actually went through and read this study. Not a scientist. Let's put that out there. If you did, am I a scientist? No, I'm not. Nothing close. I'm a preacher. I did read this study to the best of my ability. And here's what it found. Social distancing was made up. And people have admitted that now. 6 feet, that was just something that was made up. The masks, I think a lot of people really believed that they worked. There was a lot of evidence, especially anecdotal evidence, coming out pretty early on that the masks were not going to be effective unless they were KN95 or P2 respirators, I think, what they're called, and they're worn correctly, which we don't know how to do. Doctors know how to do it. They actually take classes on the protective gear that they have to wear, and they learn how to do it, and we don't know how to do it. And no one was teaching us how to do it. And most people aren't going to wear KN95s, because I wore one for 1 week when we had COVID in our house, and I had a freaking scab on the edge of my big schnoz here for like 6 months. I was obviously wearing it wrong, or that's just what it does or something. I don't know. But masks out in the community are not working. Social distancing is made up and is not working. And we also looked back in this postmortem of what happened, and we found what sounds quite obvious, which is that locking people down in their homes, separating them from their communities, not allowing them to be there when their parents died, missing birthdays, missing funerals, postponing weddings, all of that had dire effect. And there have been a lot of people who have looked back just statistically at this and said, even if it did move the needle on COVID, the deaths of despair and the depression and the loss of income and the loss of savings and the closing of businesses, it's a hard case to say that these really equaled each other out. And so what is our role? And specifically as believers, what is our role knowing what we know? Because one of the things that Christians have to remember, and we should all live this way, is it's always wrong to lie. Telling the truth is always the kind and appropriate thing to do. And it's not just that we tell the truth, but how we tell the truth that matters. I think there's a tension here between what Jesus said in Matthew 5, an appropriate tension to manage. Blessed are the peacemakers. This is a part of the Beatitudes where Jesus basically takes the way the world is understood and the way power hierarchies are created and just flips it over and turns it on its head. Blessed are the peacemakers. And in Acts, where the apostle says, we must obey God rather than men. Now, that was a very, very direct moment of the government of Israel trying to stop them from telling people about Jesus. And they just said, we have to obey God. We have to do what is right. We have to follow our conscience in taking care of our communities. We know what it does to quarantine people, to take people's jobs away. We know and can't pretend like we don't know that many of the measures we implemented and some people are beginning to re-implement are silly and not effective. And so we've got to manage this. Everyone should be allowed to speak their piece. Christians need to be vocalizing their thoughts and their ideas. I do that on this podcast, try to do it respectfully. I try to do it in non-divisive ways, although people have gotten after me in the comments when they don't agree with me. And I appreciate that. You definitely don't have to agree with me. I'm doing my best to look at these current issues through the lens of what I believe about Scripture, and I hope it's helpful to some of you. But we have to do that as peacemakers. Our primary instructions, Jesus said, all of the law can be summarized like this: to love God and to love people. And as the rest of the New Testament spells that out for us, here seems to be the way that actually functions. The way that you love God, the primary way you demonstrate your love to God, is by how you love the people around you, how you love his children. And not just the people you like, and not just the people who vote like you, and not just the people who have your same ideas about COVID and COVID measures, all people in all places. And so I'm going to hold to my convictions through this. And in the things I'm responsible for, which specifically are my family and the leadership of Meta Church, I'm going to hold to the convictions and to what we know now based on the data. But I'm going to do it absolutely as loving and appropriately and non-divisively as I can. And I hope you'll consider doing that same thing. This has been episode 30 of the Clayton Tyner podcast. I'm having so much fun on here. I'm so thankful for everyone who just gets busy down there in the comments. Every time you comment, that lets YouTube know that people are paying attention to this video. And because they're paying attention to it, they put it in front of more people. They recommend it. They put it on Watch This Next. They do all those kinds of things. The YouTube algorithm is a great mystery, but I'm trying to be consistent in content. And the more you interact, the more you share this, and especially the more you subscribe. The majority of people who are watching my videos at this point are not subscribed. If you're one of those people, it's so simple. I'm not going to bother you. Just hit that subscribe button. If you're listening only, head over to youtube.com/Clayton Tyner and subscribe. Check out some other videos and follow me at Clayton Tyner. That's Clayton Tyner on Twitter and Instagram. And I will see you next week on episode 31 of the Clayton Tyner podcast.